So what have we seen? That's globally, right? So we're seeing more global families than ever. What we saw at the end of the last year was a influx of assets into the U.S. in trust structure for people who wanted to get out of CRS reporting, come into the U.S. and be subject to FATCA. So our trust companies had a boon at the end of last year of bringing in trusts that they still controlled, but they said, we can be under that rule and we trust it a lot more for what's going to happen. Where we're running into things is when we have multi-jurisdictional families in different jurisdictions and the rules are changing constantly. And when I go into a jurisdiction, the financial institutions don't want to take on the liability. So it's a financial institution that's really driving this. So even our US citizens who are under FATCA, who have assets all over the world, a UBS account in Switzerland, or just assets, the banks are sending them CRS reporting in the US. So even US citizens who are subject to FATCA who have worldwide assets are being annoyed by this by the banks. It's constantly changing, and then it's going through a theory of, can I tell them to go away? So you're in good company is what I tell you. So it's not just Latin American countries, it's multi-jurisdictional families who are dealing with this, and it'll continue to get complex. So what I'm going to do is we're going to talk about success based on our experience with, if you think about wealth transition, what those successes are. So you had a great presentation this morning with Amy Schumer. Amy and I are good friends. We work on several clients together. So there's this paradox. So what I'm going to do is kind of back up from where Amy was, where she said, hey, business paradox, and say, okay, what are the good blocking and tackling things that you need to think about when you think about wealth transition in a family and what's kind of been tried and true. I always like to start a little bit because I stand up here. There's Alex. Who is he? Who am I? I show up, so I like to tell everybody a little bit about me. That's my beautiful, I'm the beautiful husband of my wife, Teresa, who's there. I'm the father of two daughters, Simone and Monet. You probably want to know why they have French names. My wife's grandfather homesteaded in a place called Wagon Mound, New Mexico. He was a French Basque. They still own a 6,000-acre ranch that's family-owned. Her family, her mother has 10 brothers and sisters that still we have to govern around that ranch. So I'm married into that business. I like swimming and skiing. As you see my daughter over there, she's a competitive swimmer at the University of Chicago. I would tell you, if you have one day to live, go to a swim meet because they last forever and you can you can live forever. I like Maker's Mark bourbon, although I probably should have changed that to say Floricana rum. Summer barbecues. Now, am I qualified to talk about family business? So this was my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. I have 6 brothers and sisters myself. We have 5 spouses. We have some outlaws as well as in-laws. There are 20 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. So this was this summer at their thing. So I've always had a fascination around family business. And what I can tell you is we don't have a business except on my wife's side. My dad was in farming. The dynamics that go on in a group like this without the complexity of wealth are enormous, right? So we talked about that this morning. So forget that it's complex anyway. We're talking about my parents. My mother survived stage 4 breast cancer. The 4 of us to help decide what was going to happen in their estate, or the 7 of us, was an exercise. So I just want you to know that I've always had a fascination. This gives you a little bit of background into why I find family dynamics and that stuff so interesting. So let's see what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about why plan. Why should I do this? And I can tell you around the world, people say, hey, I don't have inheritance tax. I don't need to worry about that. And I'll give you a story of somebody who did great inheritance planning and how it broke up because they didn't follow some of these governing rules on that. So I know we have multi-jurisdictions. The tax rules are going to be different in every jurisdiction. When we were here 2 years ago, they were just talking about inheritance taxes in Latin America. And what we told you was, welcome to the world that the U.S. has been living with. And I'll talk about those statistics, what inheritance taxes really do to estates or families, and why the planning is so important. Talk about succession, some good governance models, and then a process. I love this quote. We say we didn't get the company from our fathers. We're borrowing it from our children. We don't think in quarters. We think in generations. So earlier today, Amy said, what does this mean? So private equity in the U.S. is now saying, we're thinking long term. How many years does people think private equity think that is? Ricardo? 4 or 5 years. 6, 7? Yeah, so they say, oh, it's 7 to 10 years. That's long term, right? Family business, it's generational. It's generational. It's not 4 or 5 years, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. So let's talk about the statistics. So right now, based on a survey done by Mass Mutual, 88% of the people in that survey believe the family business is going to be family controlled. Okay? However, this survey just done globally by UBS says 43% of family offices, and I'll define that broadly as a holding company that controls your capital, says there's going to be generational transition in the next 10 years, 69% in the next 15 years. So advisors like me know that there's $4 trillion of capital about to change hands in a very short period of time. So if you haven't thought about this globally, people are thinking about this, and everybody's thinking about this. Private equity, advisors, other people are thinking about this huge generational transition and wealth shift that's about to happen. So forget legal structure, what trust you have it in, where you have it. Think generational transition. If the control is going to change on $4 trillion, A, is your control and your succession set? B, are there opportunities for you? So I had dinner last night with some folks, and you were saying tremendous interest in this region as an emerging market. You've seen lots of capital want to pour in here to get higher returns. In the US, family businesses during this generational transition are looking for bargains and ways to buy these families that aren't prepared for this transition. So there's a huge opportunity in the market, I think, now and in the next 10 years for families that aren't prepared. These are the statistics that we've gone over, right? 70% second, third. We've got a ton of third and fourth generation families in this room, so you've done an excellent job. John Ward started to try to do some research on this last one. This 20% go to the third generation. There was just a study done by St. Gallen University in Switzerland. They're one of the well-known family business institutions. They are doing a study on transgenerational wealth. Sometimes I say transgender when it comes out, and that's not good. That'll be a whole other topic for family later. We're not going to talk about that. But what the concept is if you look at your family capital, so forget about the core business that you have. If you look at your generational capital, does the family keep the generational capital intact for greater returns and to look for new opportunities over time? And what they're finding is that this statistic is much higher than you think it is. So in the US, the example is newspaper. Newspaper died 10 years ago, and if you didn't go digital, some of the big billion-dollar families that were billionaires in the newspaper industry were broke. Why? Because they held on to the family business too long. They didn't get in this, what preserved the capital. The other big one, how many people are familiar with Walmart? There was a little company called Fingerhut. You ever heard of it? Before there was Walmart in the US, you used to get this little catalog that would go to your house. You'd open it up and you'd say, I need a crock pot, a coffee pot, some dishes, and you'd order it. Fingerhut, the family, as soon as Walmart started opening, they said, you know what? I'll bet you people are going to want to go to Walmart and buy that versus me send out this little catalog. They sold at the peak. They're actually a Louisiana family when everybody else wanted to get in the catalog business, and they preserved their capital. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that. And as a family, you need to be thinking more about your generational capital than the core business that you're dealing with. These are just the saying, shirt sleeves are shirt sleeves. China, I should add one for Latin America. Mexico, merchant father, son playboy, grandson peasant. Right? Ring some bells. And after the presentation this afternoon, I'm thinking I'm gender biased, but as I look at these, they're heavily male dominated. Okay, so what do we think are contributing factors to success? Anybody? Success in family business. Governance, okay. So what it'll tell us, I love this one. It says attorneys and accountants aren't bad. It says only 3% of failures are due to lack of poor estate planning in any jurisdiction. Next one, 10% attributable to transfer tax. So when you talk about wealth transfer, I like to put those two slides up because you could take those off the table. Right? It's not about the structures you put in place. There's lots of really smart accountants and people, and I know you guys have some incredible structures in this room, and we do more estate planning in the US than anybody because of our system, and several of you are familiar with that. For those of you that are not familiar, in the US, the benefit you get for being a US citizen is every time you die, we take 40% of the value of all of your assets. That's the benefit. So if you're a US citizen. So I spend a lot of my time helping our US families plan around that. to not have that happen. So the structures, I'm going to go through one example that's going to tell you they did an amazing job of this and how the family failed. 12% are due to a lack of mission or purpose in the family. 25% inadequately prepared heirs. Now, that's why everybody's in this room, right? And we brought the families together. I can't tell you how many times in the U.S. somebody goes, well, I don't want my son to know. And in today's world, I find that really funny when I'm sitting with an 80-year-old who's got a 60-year-old son, and he says he's not ready. Or I've got a 60-year-old who's got a 40-year-old son, and you Google the family, right? Tells how much they gave to charity. I can find the tail number on their jet. He already knows, right? So by not talking to them or preparing them for this wealth and this transition, big problem for families. 60% due to a lack of communication and trust. So you don't have this airline in America. What's your favorite airline to fly if you fly commercial? And why do we love Copa? So if you've been in the U.S., there's a tiny airline called Southwest. What I love about Southwest is I was in the airport the other day. They had this screen, and it said whether my flight had taken off from its location, when it was going to land, when they were going to deboard the plane, when I could board, and it had the timeline. I also flew American Airlines from San Francisco to Miami last week. My flight was late. Nobody told me anything. The two people stood there. It caused tension, right? So lack of communication and the lack of information, there's misinformation, right? So we tell families this all the time. If you're not telling your family what you want the story to be, they will fill in the blanks for you. And they will generally be not the positive stuff, right? It'll be the other stuff that you haven't thought about, okay? And before all you math whizzes figure out that this doesn't add up to 100%, these are from different studies. They're not supposed to be 100%. 60% are attributable to how successor family members interact, right? A lot of you here are cousins. A lot of you here are brothers and sisters, right? So how have we decided to act and integrate together? So a lot of this family business paradox, we're trying to bring the family together across those. If you're not doing that, there's a huge rate of failure, okay? So this speed of trust equation, I always get a debate as to whether that's true, whether I should trust my children. How many of you are familiar with Warren Buffett? Yeah? How does Warren Buffett do deals? Does anybody know? How does he do deals? Does he hire a bunch of accountants? Lawyers? No. He goes and he says, Carlos, hey, I love your company. Let's sit down, let's break bread. And he says, okay, we're going to do the deal. They paper it up, doesn't take that long, and then they get a check. So Stephen Covey wrote this thing, so I like to use, when people talk about family business, they say, well, is that real? Well, it is. So Stephen Covey said, if trust is low, speed's low, cost is high. All you got to do is think about every M&A transaction like that. If trust is high, speed is high, and cost is low. So if you think about generational transition in your family and all the reason you're spending time here, are you spending time on this trust? Do people know what my intent is? The reason I flew here from San Francisco, I was with a family that's a $4 billion company, and they sold 49% of their interest to private equity. Yikes, right? We're good, I don't know. I was out there because the kids who were in their mid-40s were upset and livid that their dad did this. And their dad said, well, I had a very good reason. I wanted to take some chips off the table. This private equity guy is a strategic buyer for us, and he can open markets that I'm not in, and I'm going to take my product there. And then when he doesn't understand me anymore, I'm going to buy back his piece of the 50%. I said, great, why don't you tell the kids that? And he said, well, if they would have just come and asked me, I would have told them. And we sat down with the kids, and they said, well, you know, it's his company. I don't know if I can tell him that. I don't know what. So this trust thing they're dealing with, they don't trust each other, even though under the covers they trust each other. So they sold for this wonderful price. It's a good synergy right now. It's been really good for the business, but there's incredible turmoil in the family right now. It's about to break them up. One brother left the business. They got a daughter trying to run it. Another daughter left the business, so it's caused tremendous strife within the family, even though their estate planning is really good. Okay. I'm going to get to that in a second. So the story I want to tell you about complexity in estate planning is, anybody stay at a Hyatt hotel before? Hyatt Hotel? Do you know who owns Hyatt Hotels? Pritzker. How many people have studied the Pritzker story? You have? You? So what happened in Pritzker? Anybody know? What happened in Pritzker? You know the CEO. He knows the family. That's good. So Mr. Pritzker came to the U.S. from Italy, bought this little company on a napkin called Hyatt, and created this tremendous wealth. They were bigger than Walmart, bigger than Koch brothers. He had 1,000 trusts set up for his heirs. 1,000 trusts, all in offshore structures that were never going to be subject to U.S. estate tax again, and they could continue to never going to pay U.S. income tax until the money was brought back on shore. Man, he did a good job. What happened in 2009? He died. When he died, do you think anybody knew what his intent was? I kind of gave you a preface to the question. So what happened in 2009? Does anybody know? A group of the cousins and siblings got together, and they were going to go to court to break up the trust. And they all agreed that they were going to pay estate taxes and take $1.4 billion each as a share of this. They would have done that. It would have been totally quiet, except for there were 2 heirs that they left out of the secret meeting. And one of those heirs sued the family and said, I didn't get my fair share. So then it became a public spectacle. So if you want to, there's a great Vanity Fair article that was written in 2013 on this. But if you want to read a case study in brilliant estate planning, brilliant structure to create a dominant legacy company, and no transparency to the family, and as soon as the person who controlled it was gone, they said, guess what? We're going to take care of it. So now you have five different family members, each with about $3 billion. They split up all the assets, and they all now have reconstituted what they're doing. So again, from a U.S. perspective, and I know in Latin America, transfer and wealth transfer hasn't had to be done because of the rules down here. In the U.S., it needed to be done. Somebody put in a great structure to never be subject to it again. And the people who wanted to control the assets said, They wrote big checks to the federal government to get control back of their assets. To me, it's fascinating because I walk around telling everybody, put it in there, put it in there. And they were willing to pay court costs, lawyer fees, and write a big check to the federal government, which nobody likes to do in the U.S., just to get control of these assets back. So it's a pretty amazing story. What this slide is meant to do is just talk about at these generational transition and inflection points, you need to be prepared for what happens in the family. So, operating business equity, then what happens? Well, everybody starts to want to have a better lifestyle. That's this yellow line. Maybe I get new investment opportunities. Maybe I have ongoing ownership transitions. These generational transfers, that's why you see the spotted lines. People don't generally get beyond those if you haven't planned ahead of time. So when you look at it, what's driving the growth in your business? How do I avoid that? How can I improve future outcomes? Everything you heard from Amy and everything you heard on Women in Business is this. How do I jump this generational transition? And if I have good planning and good governance and I think about this, I don't have this disruption and demise. I can't tell you how many companies have gone there that I'm aware of. Okay? The other thing I heard today, people asked about public companies. So this is generally the view of a first-generation family kind of in the Western world. Because of these issues, what options do I have? And we talked about it today, this parity. Am I more about family unison or am I more about individualism? Right? So at the top, I stay invested in the business. I own the business. Maybe I want to be partial. Right, the client that I just talked about in California. IPO, merger, and then this is a full exit. So the one that everybody asked today is IPO. Isn't it just better to go public? Liquidity issues of the family will go away. We can trade the shares fully. Wouldn't that be great? So what's the statistic on how long public companies survive? Give me a number. Come on, we heard. What? How long do public companies survive? 5 years, 10 years, 60 years, forever? So in the 1920s, it was 67 years public companies survived. By 2012, it was 15 years. So there were 2 studies. There was and I always have to write these down because I can't say this name right, But there was a BBC article in 2012. That was a Yale study. 67 years in 1920. In 2012, 15 years. There was a Time magazine article in 15 that said the average life of a public company is now 10 years. So in the US, we're having a lot of families where we have this discussion. So even in other emerging markets where people are going to come in and say, hey, IPO makes sense, not always, because all of a sudden you've taken, which I heard you guys this morning, about why you're special as family businesses. So just think about that from a statistical perspective. Okay, so those are the statistics, right? Most people don't make it past these generational points, and they have these bumpy roads if they don't deal with these type of issues. So let's talk about a broad framework of how we might do that as a family. Sure.
When they say they don't get past the general because they're not in the same business, or the wealth disappeared?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the old studies, it's because their wealth disappeared. I'm sorry. In the old studies, it's because they didn't own the same business. I said that wrong. So there's an article that was just written. I mentioned it at St. Gallen. All those studies that you heard before, it's because they didn't own the same core business. So which might have been smart, exactly. So if Copa Airlines, the airline industry was awful, and we said we're going to sell it to somebody, the highest bidder, and go reinvest in cane sugar, that would be a successful transition today in that St. Gallen study. In the old studies, that would have been a failure because you don't own that core business anymore. Yeah, the original stats. This is just talking about, so these aren't stats. This is talking about when you have a generational transition, you need to think about how to go there and not let this disruption ruin the company. So if you don't have this generational capital mindset, then, and you're too worried about your business, like you just said, this is where you can fall down. The other great example, are you guys familiar with a company named Welch Allen? Ever heard of Welch Allen? How many people have gone to the doctor and had a blood pressure test? Something stuck in your ear. Welch Allen is one of the largest, still is one of the largest manufacturers of medical devices. They were a family-owned company, fourth generation. All the family members, they had a great governance structure. They go speak all over the world on it. What started happening in the medical industry? Is anybody in the medical industry in the room? So in the U.S., what started happening is doctor groups consolidated, hospitals consolidated, and oh, by the way, Welch Allen made a really good product that didn't wear out. So all you business people, what was happening to profits? Right? So they said, we're being disrupted by these market issues. They had a board, and the board had full discretion whether to sell the company or not sell the company. They put that in place so that people that thought it was a family business wouldn't be enamored with it and keep it forever because it had been a 100-year company. What that board did is they decided to invest $300 million into R&D to try to get jump-started on new product and get the revenue stream up. They did that over a 3-year period with no help, and it still went down. So that board decided, and they sold the company for $8 billion. But they quickly had in place this generational transition. So what they said was, we're getting out of being a family-owning business. Now we're going to own capital. We're going to redeploy it into new businesses and new types of investments. It was extremely traumatic on the family, but they've worked through it because they had these governance structures in place to where the business didn't become so important. So I think what you're seeing all over the world is this concept of owning the same thing all the time is going away, and it's having the right structures to go from asset to asset or diversification to diversification. I like to put this slide up. I think we put it up before. So we call it a DNA of a family business. If I sit in an owner's shoes, what this says is I'm thinking about all these things is family and business are intertwined. It's in your DNA. You talked about it this morning with Amy. And when you start to talk about generational transition, there are a bunch of other levers that happen. So we put 8 strategic issues on here. You could read them: future management structure, effective tax management, growth and sustainability. What we're saying is every time you think of one, it's intertwined with the family, and you probably have to think of the other strategic issue. So as you go through this wealth transition, be thinking about these strategic issues and how they fit into what you're doing. And most people just think of them as, oh, I got to do next generation planning. Well, that's a board or whatever. Well, what about growth and sustainability? What do I have to do to manage the capital? We have lots of Latin American families that have operations of their financial assets in Miami or Boston, where they've set up a family office and they're investing in private equity and other things. Well, that's managing capital for the family, and how do I do that? So just think more broadly, I would say, of all of these strategic issues as you're thinking about wealth transition and strategy. I like to bring this up. If you're in the banking industry, you know this. The disruption around Bitcoin, technology, transparency, all of our young people are coming to our older families and are driving all discussions off of what's happening in the wealth management industry. So in the US, our young people want transparency into the assets of the family. Why do you think that is? What can I do on my phone in the US? Everything. Everything. I can go to my phone and say, okay, my bank account balance is this. I get to deposit my check like that. My Merrill Lynch guy does this. So why can't my family just put that on the phone and tell me? So this wealth management industry is driving the decisions that we're having. I heard the question earlier today, robotics, IPA, smart intelligence. That's driving everything, and families are being driven there. And then this one is an interesting one. The millennial transition, and there's millennials in the room, is changing the way things are being think about. That was good. That was bad English for a guy from Texas. Thought about. So EY did a study on millennials, okay? And it was in the Americas. And two things we asked them. What are the organizations you trust the least? And what are the organizations you trust the most? So organizations. So who did they trust the least? Government? Yes. You win. Ding. I should have some prizes. Who else? Government? Politicians? Governors was on there. I don't know. I think because in the U.S. there's a lot of governors that do bad things, but it was governors. Banks, corporate America, they trusted the least. So those were the three they trusted the least. Who do you think they trusted the most? Their friends. So think organizationally, kind of like banks and governments. Anybody? I hear people kind of mumbling. Who? Isn't that odd? Nobody wants to. So the people they trusted the most at the top. Family business? Wasn't family business. So at the top was the military, colleges and universities, sports franchises. Everybody gets a chuckle out of that one, right?
Where are churches in it? Where are the churches?
Religion was kind of in the middle. And I think that's there's a diversity of whether you're religious or not in the U.S., so I don't think it was as high as it probably, and we've had a lot of the Catholic Church scandals in certain places. I didn't study the results. So what did I look at the study and say? If you look at those bottom three organizations, misinformation, I can't trust you, I don't think you're looking out for me, right? If I go to the top three organizations, you protect me, that may be questionable in some places on the military, but you teach me and you inspire me. So when I look at what families are doing, their next generation doesn't think like the older generation did in these conversations. They want to be excited. They want to be involved. They want to think of things this way, not what's the estate plan? You can't have that information. I can't tell you. So when you're thinking about how to educate your next gen, you really need to be looking at these studies and what's going on, because to have them come in and be involved, it's a different conversation than it's ever been. So just something to think about. And it was very interesting. As we've talked to people, they're like, yeah, that's right. My millennials keep coming and saying, can't we do this meeting a lot shorter? Couldn't there be some cool graphics? Like it'd be better if I had like videos and things where it was interactive, right? So things are changing from that perspective in a big way. We talked about this, and this goes back to what Amy talked about this morning. So EY did a study where we surveyed the 1,000 largest families across the globe and said, what makes those families better and successful? And the number one two things were family cohesion and business growth. So what the survey found was that if we thought we were a family and we wanted to be identified that way, and we had a growth ambition, meaning we weren't just sitting on our assets, we were growing our assets, that's what we were about. Our business, we had business success, sustainability. The return on investment was 35% higher in these companies than their peer group. So we call it the sustainability circle. But if you identify as a family business and you're cohesive as a family, all those lack of trust things we get out of the equation, and we're focused on growth, your ROI outperforms your competitors significantly. It just came out on Monday, so I don't have it. There was a UBS study that talked about how private companies outperform their public company counterparts in all regards. So you guys are the cream of the crop. And then for the cream of the crop of family-owned businesses, if you have these two things, you're above your own cream of the crop, is what the study was telling us. Okay, so of those family businesses that were successful, that had this 35% better return on investment, what type of things did they have in place? Some of you guys have them. What did they have in place? Okay. So 42% had articles of incorporation. 43% had bylaws. Those are your legal documents. 64% have a family council that meets regularly. Right? So you guys have talked about this. I've heard a lot of you. I did hear that there's one family, it took a while to put this in place, and they said, now I have to live it. Right? So it's one thing to put a family council in place. It's another thing to meet regularly and have it function. 70%. Have a family meeting and discuss family issues. How many times do family issues kind of cross over to business, kind of diagonal? What these said is we have a family council that meets, but we also had a place to bring family issues to the table, separate and apart from business issues. 90%. Regular shareholder meetings to discuss business issues. So what the study was telling us, this family cohesion, was to have a place to allow family to be family, as you're thinking about generational transition, and then another place to allow business to be business. And I think Amy brought up the paradox. Well, maybe now we could do both, but let's think about the venue of how we do both. But this fascinated me because I think all this gets merged. We design a lot of family charters and family governance, and then what's the first thing everybody says? Well, can't we just have one meeting, mush this all together, and just, right? It feels like a board meeting of a company. If you really practice these things, it's shown to have greater success generationally in transition.
I think they're just not family issues. I mean, business issues. They're family issues and personal,
right,
interrelationship issues that
yeah.
get discussed with people.
Yeah, and I think what the study found was if we could have a place to discuss those, when you were in the meeting and you really wanted to discuss business, you could really focus on this growth. You could focus on your next CEO, what the next transition that you're doing, versus this meeting get bogged down based on those family issues. Conflict. How many people love conflict? Right? But it's not bad. So what the study told us was family cohesion, if you have higher family cohesion, you can have lower conflict. So 47% of the families with high conflict reported high cohesion. 57% of the families with low conflict had high cohesion. So remember, cohesion is a factor in your return on investment. Conflict doesn't mean that you're bad. All it's saying is if you had high cohesion, 47% had low conflict, 57% had low conflict. And I'll talk at the end. This is something we're talking about a lot. What is your mechanism for conflict other than going to the lawyers? Right? What's the mechanism to deal with conflict other than going to the lawyers? Okay, so you got this from Amy today. It's the well-known survey. It's the well-known study, the 3-circle model. If you're new and young, I'd encourage you to study it. There hasn't been kind of a change on it in a long time, and it's kind of the baseline. How many of you have seen this continuum before? Show of hands. Right? So the older families are going to be aware of this. So transition gets harder as there's more people, right? You saw me. I have 7 siblings. My partnership was pretty good. The cousin consortium for my family is 36 or 32. My wife's family on the ranch, their cousin consortium is 100 people. The complexity of this causes things. You got to do this today with Amy, right? I love taking other people's stuff, so I need to think about this different. What's the paradox of when I think of family issues, do I think family first or business first? Or when I think about business issues, do I think family first or business first? And this is am I going to employ everybody because it's the right thing to do in the family? Am I going to have criteria for when people come into the company? Those type of things. This is a part where I ask, do you think it matters that people have outside work experience before they join your company? How many people say yes? Raise your hands. How many people say no? 1. What is everybody else? In the middle? So there is no published or statistical study that says it matters whether you have outside work experience. It gets quoted a lot. A lot of people recommend it. But there is no statistical study that outside work experience helps you improve the success of your family. This is a new book that was written by Justin Craig. He took over the program at Kellogg. So all you John Ward disciples, you've probably heard Lloyd Shevsky. Justin is a Australian who's coming to the company. He just released this book called The 4 L's. If you are a 3rd or 4th generation family, I would encourage you to go buy this book. Because what Justin Craig tried to do was exactly what we talked about, that these old rules and the way we thought about family business have changed. There have to be new mechanisms for us to think about how we govern our family going forward. And this was one of his first things. So he calls it the 4 L's. And everything in the book is in 4 so you can remember it. So he said, first, you need to learn business. Right? So I need to learn business. Just the good fundamentals of business. Number 2, I need to learn the family business. If I'm trying to learn the family business without good fundamentals, it's much harder. Family businesses may not do things the best way, so it's best to learn business and then learn the family business. Then the 3rd thing is learn to lead. This is something that families struggle with, and what he was saying is, once you understand what business is and once you understand what the family business is, the next thing you need to understand is, what does it really mean to lead? And you had a whole session this afternoon about women leadership or other leadership. This is very different than just being a part of the business. So what are the criteria? What am I going to do? Then based on this evaluation, learn to let go. So I'm going to become a governor or an owner. I'm not going to be in the business running it. Families there hasn't been a model really to think about that. We talk about it in the 3-circle model, but we don't talk about a transition. There's more in the book on this. The other thing he did, and I don't have a flip chart, is he said, you have to think about, for this criteria, what are you going to do? What is the set criteria going to be, and do you know what it is? How many people have a set criteria for how you evaluate leaders in the business, owners in the business, family, and leaders in the business? Yes? No? Let me pull this up here because it'll make more sense. Yeah. So in the book, there are a lot of good little tools. It's not rocket science. But what he said was, there's a role, there's a responsibility, there's a requirement, and then there's remuneration. So there's money. And this is called the 4 R's. And this one is, if I'm an owner, if I'm a director, if I'm an employee, or I'm a family member. Okay? So if I'm an owner, that's the role. Do I have a clear definition on what my responsibilities are as an owner? Do I have a clear definition of what the requirements are to be an owner? Most people, when they do estate planning, this is pretty check box. You got to be bloodline. You have to do whatever. But what are the requirements for me to be an owner? Do I have to have education? Do I have to have certain responsibilities? And then what remuneration do I get? So what is this? Dividends, cash flow. Do you have that policy in place? Directors. I heard there's a lot of boards in here, right? What are the requirements to be on your board? Well defined. Do I have the responsibilities of my board? Well defined. And do I know what I pay my board members? How many family members? Well, I shouldn't ask that because everybody else. The number one thing we find is people sit on the family board and they don't get paid. Would you sit on and do something if you didn't get paid? I wouldn't, but I mean, there's an obligation, right, in a family to do that. Employees, so this is the leadership box, and you got to have two, employee and leader, right? So am I an employee in the company, family employee, or am I family leader? What's the requirement? I mean, what's the responsibility as that leader? What's the requirement? What's the wage? This one's easy, right? These are comp studies, right? That's external. I can go find that. And then finally, as a family member, do I get anything as a family member? Remember our 3 circles? If I'm not an owner and I'm just a family member, and I show up at family council meetings, and I do all those things, should I get anything? Maybe. But do I have a code of conduct that says, I'm in the family, my responsibilities of being part of the family, and if I participate where they ask me to, will I be paid to do that? We have one 6th-generation family in the U.S. They have a full education committee, and they have a full education program from age 6 to age 46 for their family members. If you participate in the education program to learn how to become a good family member, you get paid. Why did they do that? How many people have jobs? How many people have a job in here? How many people have a job not working for the family company? How hard is it to get time off from your non-family company to go to your family company stuff? Yeah? We actually have families where the uncle says, well, he's working in my business, so he can't have off to go to that. You know, I get all that. So what this was doing was trying to alleviate that and saying, I can come because I'm not having to take time off and use my vacation and all those things. So that's why that was put there. So again, I put this up. It's a great book. I haven't had time to fully study it, but I was with Justin and Amy at Kellogg back in June. And I was fascinated because for those experienced families, it's a new way of thinking about how do you make successful generation transition and wealth transfer. It's kind of the next evolution. You guys talked a little bit about this today too. So this helps with this, but this is the active inactive, right? So you talked about it this morning. If you have good governance in families, is my mic wearing out or? Oh, you're going to take this down. Thank you. So the conflicts that arise, I think it's a magnet. Amy covered this today. So if I'm active in the business, these are the things that I'm getting. If I'm inactive, those are the things I want. Just like you talked about, I don't think the people that are active in the business are trying to not do this for those people. What you find is there's generally a lack of clear understanding around those. A lack of this is what, do I have a clear dividend policy? Do I know what I get paid? And I know what that formula is. This is a number one question we get asked in the U.S. by big families. The issue is there's no statistic or valid study on it. Everybody comes to me and they say, what do family companies pay dividends to their family? And no family wants to publish that information, and you certainly don't want to tell me. So that's the number one question. So then we have to look to ancillary data. What would a company of your size in the public market pay? If you just went back to fundamentals of finance, what would be a good capital structure in your company? And what we find is the reason companies don't pay dividends is double taxation. That's number one, ineffective. Number two, need it for growth. Right. So when you're trying to grow, private companies are generally debt averse. You guys don't like to borrow a lot of money. You don't want the bank to hold you. Right? So is your capital structure, if you went to any private equity firm, what would they tell you? Your capital structure is, oh, it's bad. Right? It sucks. Except 2008 when the world blew up and your capital structure was just fine. Right? So that's the other reason is a lot of that could be financed if you took on normal debt. But if you don't take on normal debt and you're trying to grow, you can't fund that. We have one huge company that went from $300 million to $4 billion in the U.S. They're a well-known brand that you would know. The family members are screaming right now because they know what the company's worth and nobody's getting any dividends out of the company. Why do you think that is? The growth. To go from $300 million to $4 billion took a tremendous amount of capital. All the capital is going back in to grow the company. And so now they have people in looking at that to see how they can fix that capital structure. This is the same thing, just saying as more people, it was much easier when it was just the 7 of us. Now that there's 36, exponentially this problem gets bigger quickly. So don't have kids no, just kidding. Okay. So we kind of talked about those different models. So what I would say to you, and I did this, I was fortunate enough, we run a next-gen program where we bring the next generation of entrepreneurial families together, and we partner with institutions like Kellogg. And I was at INSEAD in Abu Dhabi. If you've never been to Abu Dhabi, it's one of the oddest places. It's the only place in the world where the government would invest in huge infrastructure before there was business there to support it. So these beautiful buildings, beautiful malls, and there's no people. Why? Because they've created the island of Mukal, and they're going to make it a tax-free zone. So if you haven't looked into it, you might, as Latin Americans who can do that, you might look into that. But we brought a lot of the younger generation together. We have a lot of third and fourth generation families. Those third and fourth generation children are questioning the prior structures. So if you're a family in this room that's done a really good job with your board, really good job with your family council, really good job with connecting people, I would encourage you to go back through some of the new literature like that you saw with Amy in this, because the questions we were getting from those folks are, I don't really understand how this family council thing works. I want to know what the next evolution is for a seventh generation family. So those things I just went through can be tools for you to kind of go back and revisit that, especially if you're a long-term generational family. All right, so we kind of talked about the statistics. We talked about the different models. Now, what's the process you should use to go through if you're going to do wealth transition? What I'll tell you is most people jump over here to execute the plan. I go to meetings in the US and everybody goes, oh, I'm ready to do estate planning, let's do all this stuff. And then I back up and I tell them the Pritzker story and I tell them all the other things. So really, number one is purpose and philosophy, right? What is the purpose and philosophy of your family? That has to be set first. What do we believe about wealth? What do we believe about responsibilities, those things? Then preparing the plan, right? And you notice this is a circle. It's iterative. So most good families with family councils are constantly looking at this. And then you've got all the outside forces pushing on you as you're doing this. There's tons of models out there. I'll tell you that ours isn't proprietary, but if you really go through these phases, it causes more success. So again, when we talk about it, why do we do succession? Why do we do wealth transition? Manage expectations, define common values, agree on conflict resolution, and a process for that. This is just another play on the three-circle model. I got to worry about leadership, ownership, legacy, and values in wealth transition in a family. And so when we start to think about this, we say there are three buckets that you really need to think about. So the question is, where are you on your journey as a family? Number one, which most of you have been through, is family governance. Do we have shared values? Do we have a mission statement? Do we have a family council? Have we put that block in place? Right? So we think that's number one. Rules of engagement at the family level and cooperation. Do I have these things? Shareholder agreement, strategy, board of directors. And is there communication and operation between the two? Then the third one, which most people haven't thought about, and it goes back to this generational capital, is do I have governance of the wealth? In the US, we do a tremendous amount of work taking family offices out of this operating business. Why do you think that is? What happens when that managing the wealth is in there? How many people have the company help you when you buy a house? Finance a house, file your taxes. So what we find is, what happens is that corporate governance gets overwhelmed and the business gets overwhelmed by family stuff. So then when there's enough accumulation and we have trusts and we've got assets we have to manage and we've got lawyers to talk to, the formality of wealth governance is the last piece, and that's the family office. Then you have a structure that kind of sits on top that when you think about generational capital, it's not all focused in this core business. It's a broader overview of what you're thinking and looking at. I know you guys are wearing out, so. Real quickly, I wanted to do this. So this is what we call a shared vision matrix. So when I come back to this, what we say is when we go to that first item on vision, there's really two things that we have folks look at. So what are my personal goals and what are my business goals? What are my monetary goals and what are my non-monetary goals? Okay? So if you have a piece of paper, flip it over real quick. Draw these 4 boxes on your piece of paper for me. Okay? When we ask people to do this exercise, it's really uncomfortable for them every time I have somebody do it. So I want you to really quickly, in 2 minutes, fill this out. I want the first thing that comes into your head. There is no rhyme or reason here. It is you. There's no trick question. What are your personal goals, monetary and non-monetary? What are your business goals, monetary and non-monetary? What we normally do is, one, it was uncomfortable for you to fill this out, yes? When I said, hey, what are these? Because what did you start thinking? Well, what's a business goal and what's a non-business goal? Who's going to think about what I put here and what I put here? And are they going to think it's right? Okay, so it's difficult. So when we go through the exercise with families, so what we do is we say, fill this out. Then we go through the first time and we say, how many did you have in each box? And it's amazing to watch the bias if a lot show up in the monetary boxes. So if family members have 10 monetary goals and no non-monetary goals, all of a sudden the family thinks, oh, well, all he wants is money. Then we flip the page and we say, okay, tell me your goals. And everybody reads off those monetary goals, non-monetary goals. What we find out is there's high alignment. So they may have had 10, but somebody else may have thought about it differently. So when you talk about aligning vision and mission with family about this, it's a very simple exercise to walk through with the family to see where there could be misrepresentation. I'll tell you, in the business is where there's the most highly aligned. People go through this and it's easy. This personal side is the most hard. Because to have a good education, is that a monetary goal or a non-monetary goal? And then somebody will say, well, if I want to go to Babson College or the University of Chicago, that's a monetary goal versus a non-monetary. Anyway, it's a good exercise to go through to think about how to align those. I think most of you have a family charter. The question is, are you living it and breathing it? And the question is, for the next generation, is your charter aligned with this for generation 3 and 4? And did you let generation 3 and 4 have a voice in your charter around those goals to make sure they still align? And why is that important? Because generally when you say there's family governance, code of conduct, how do we feel about money? The next generation is questioning how you came up with those definitions. So most people have a good family charter, they have good family councils, and they say we have an amendment to the family council, but you generally have a junior council for next-gen members. But have you ever really gotten their voice on how they would design the family charter today?
Shouldn't you let that change?
Yes, most people believe that the family charter should change, and it should be, I've heard a great comment that it's guardrails, right? It's the rules of engagement, but it's going to constantly change. So what we believe as a family is the most important thing. So to kind of prove that, if you think vision and mission, and I've looked at some of your vision and mission statements, the guiding principle, I think, of a family charter is what's the vision and mission of the company and the family. Because that should be there for 100 years, right? Who we are as a family, what we believe in. So I've kind of, and these aren't all family companies, but I put some of these up from companies that I think you would know to kind of give you that. So what I want you to focus on is, when you read it, does it make you feel something, or is it just a thing? You know, so if EY says, hey, we're the best accountants ever in the world, that sounds like a thing, and it's more about me. It doesn't inspire anybody. So when you look at these, how do they feel? So who do we think this is? Yep, I will. Real quickly, shout it out. Who is it? All right, time's up. Enterprise Rent-A-Car. If you know about them, what do they say? We're a family-owned company, right? They use that in all of their branding. This one you may not know in Latin America, but if you're in the U.S., you may know. Edmunds. Edmunds is another, it's the family-owned company of what was Kelley Blue Book. So they're another family-owned company. Who's that? Walmart? Amazon. Amazon's overtaking them, right? Amazon Prime. Very good. Yep. Yeah. Everybody kind of questions that one when I show it, if that's still their mission today. Who's this? Cargill. This is another great study of a family. If you want to talk about a family-owned business that put their governance structure in place and had a big chasm about dividends and what family members got and they didn't get, and then they were a family that decided that they were not going to be family-run. The family was going to be the board of governors and owners, and professional management would run the company going forward. There's an incredible case study if you want to go study that. But what they say is, this is our mission. It's survived for 100 years. Our business changes every 5 in this world. So we have to point north, which is this vision and mission for the family. Tesla, yeah. Elon Musk. This is going to be gender biased when the answer comes up. Vitamix. Does anybody have a Vitamix blender? How much does it cost? $700. Jody Baugh, it's a family-owned company. Jody Baugh is the CEO. Jody Baugh went to Walmart. They told her, we'll never sell your product. It's too expensive. Jody Baugh said it's the greatest product ever. It's high quality, and people will buy it for $600 because they're not going to have to go buy 6 other blenders. This one works. Now those blenders are in Walmart at $600. But it was because this was her mission, and she was a family-owned company, and she didn't say, I'm going to give in to the Walmart of the world. So again, and these materials are up on the website, so you can download them afterwards. But so what I would say is, what we see for generational transition is your next generation, your third and fourth, or your second, aligned on vision and mission? I can't tell you how many people I sit down in our Next Gen Academy and I say, what's the vision and mission of your company? And they don't know. So we had a Next Gen program. The kids didn't know. On the last day, all the parents come in and the kids get up and present. To a T, every family-owned company that got up and presented, they didn't talk about what they did, they talked about why they did it. And so I'm sure if I had Carlos stand up or Ricardo and I said, what is it that your family or company is about? You wouldn't talk about what you do, you'd talk about why. So engaging that next generation in this conversation again to me is very important. And it's this kind of evolution as you look at the next evolution of success on this generational wealth transition. This I'm going to kind of skip over. I think most of you know this and have this, right? So this is kind of the grand dame of structure. If you've been at Kellogg or you've been other places, I have a family assembly or family council at the top. I've got a shareholders council, I've got a board of directors, and then I have this conglomerate of families underneath. I get the question the most, what's the difference between the family assembly and the shareholders council and the board of directors? So the way I look at it is, this is when you have very large families. This structure is we have families that have 150 family members. Everybody can't be on the board. Everybody can't be. So the family assembly is where the family gets together and we talk about family issues and we celebrate. We have family meetings and vacations. The shareholders council is a group elected by each branch of the family to bring issues and opportunities about the company to the board of directors. The board of directors executes on the plan down to the companies. Why is this shareholders council important for that board of directors? If you think about a very large family. I know you're tired. Too many questions. What we found is that the shareholders council, if you have it and it's run well, this is where the artist or the guy who's off doing tech, who's not a finance guy, who you wouldn't want on your board because he doesn't understand business, the voice of what they're seeing and what they'd like you to think about can be brought to the board for consideration. So remember that trust and cohesion conversation. So we've had lots of great ideas come out of this. Hey, I was out doing this and I was in a Downs thing and I saw experiential learning and there was this really cool technology that I saw. Has no idea how it works or what they should do, but what comes from the shareholders council is those cool, emerging, innovative things that now go to the board, that the board can be disciplined around evaluating and where they go. So it gives this kind of universal voice on the business from the greater group. I'm going to jump through that. In the slides, you can go through the definitions on that. This just talks about the different pieces within the different buckets on that. The final thing is retaining talent. And I'm going to talk about this in a second because I think families, we heard a little bit about this before, but again, in that study we did on succession, there were 4 key things that came out of the study for family-owned businesses. One is they clearly defined who was responsible for succession. So in your company, have you clearly defined, is it the board, is it the shareholders, is it the families? Who's responsible for succession? Number 2, they were all focused on the development of the next gen. So it sounds like you guys, if you're here, you've got that box checked, right? I've heard a lot of great schools. You guys are here to learn. Number 3 is they nurtured entrepreneurship. So they let people go out and fail. They let people go out and do things. And then number 3 is they work to attract top talent, whether it's in the family or it's not in the family. So those are the 4 key things. So when it comes to attracting top talent, these are just statistics. What we find is that family-owned businesses generally don't have a process to filter through this for top talent for their family. They do it in the company really well, and they get outside the bounds of this. So if you look at this, to do a talent search costs you 20-40% of annual salary for you to go out and search for somebody. It's highly costly to replace somebody. So we talked earlier today about gender and those things. If people are leaving your company and family members are leaving because they don't have a clear understanding of how this development happens, these are statistics for non-family-owned companies, how costly it is. So think for a family company with all the knowledge you have. We have a Canadian family that follows this to a T. They are highly private because they're an engineering firm and they believe they're proprietary. They believe that you should, if you're an engineer, you should come work in the company as soon as you're out of school. And they're so proprietary that when you go on their engineering floor, you leave your cell phone outside. They do not have desktops on the engineering floor connected to the outside world. That's how proprietary. So they said you need to learn that culture of what privacy really means, and you need to be here. Their other 2 businesses, real estate and agriculture, not the same criteria, but it's well defined on how they're going to develop talent. For the real estate company, you must go work for CBR, one of the mega real estate companies. Why? Because relationships matter. You get the best deal flow from the best relationships. The best place to see that is in those big real estate companies. Very clear criteria that you need to do that. Then come in and you can ascend up the real estate ladder. Again, who, what, where, what's the assessment going to be, and what's my talent map? So you saw that earlier today as well. And then make sure you have a pipeline to the CEO. Pipeline, key manager, CEO. How are most CEOs chosen in family business? This way? You think it's this way? How many oldest boys are in the family in here? Yeah. How many families? It's generally patriarchal or matriarchal. Generally, it's the oldest child that ascends to this role regardless of quality. So I have one example of where this diminished a family generation after generation. Real estate construction family. They're in real estate and construction. For whatever reason, they kept having 2 kids. So first generation, they had 2 boys, and they decided they couldn't figure out who was going to be the best leader, so they said, we'll split the real estate company in 2. Boom. What do you think happened? The guy who should have been CEO grew the company like this, and the other guy put it in a ditch. And that family went off this way. This guy had 2 sons. What do you think he did? Same thing. Split the company, grew. Finally, this guy said, I'm not going to do that. And I think it's because he had 3 sons, so he couldn't, he couldn't repeat it. So he came back in, and what he did was put a structure in place to say these are going to be the clear criteria, and he put an independent board in place to evaluate that criteria. And he said, we're going to have those 3 boys all compete to be CEO if they're qualified, but we're also going to look at outside candidates, and they're all going to know that. Just because you're there, we've had too many failures in this family not to think that way. The other thing he was smart enough to know, when he took over his company, it was a $300 million company. Now we were talking about a $4 billion company. He was smart enough to know that when he took over the company at $300 million, the skills he needed to run it were significantly different than today at $4 billion. And to just think that anybody can run a $4 billion company is not, regardless of how smart you are. It's just the dynamics and everything are just different. Okay, conflict resolution, and then we'll let you go get drinks. Yep. Although you all look asleep, so I'm not sure drinks are going to... Should have had them brought in. Okay, so there are two types of conflict that are generally easy to deal with. And there are three types of conflict total. So task conflict, what it is, and process, how we do it. People are generally good at these conflicts. It's a task, I don't like it, what do we do? Or it's a process. I don't like the way the process goes, I need to do that. The one that always gets there is what? Relational. So families are really good at this, businesses are really good at this, and then what happens? Well, you did that to me before. Well, and I'm amazed at how many of these are childhood things. When we were kids, you did this to me all the time. You didn't listen to me. I had a better process. Well, crap, you're both in the boardroom now. Do that. So again, when you start to think about conflict, you have to identify which bucket it goes into. Number two, if you're not identifying conflict, what will happen? It'll leak. Will you get anything done? So I have another family that's in Wisconsin. Dad died, left the assets to everybody. They're in 3 trusts, and there's one asset that's this wonderful farm and ranch. But they don't want to maintain it because it's really expensive to maintain, and a bunch of the assets went to charity. So everybody's in a meeting, and what do they agree on? Yeah, the task is that assets is not valuable. We can't maintain it. Yes, the task is we should sell it. Okay? They agreed on the process. Yes, we should sell the asset, and we should use a bid, and we should do that. Then what happened in relational? So everybody agreed, and they left the room, and all the people that had been there when they were kids, how can we sell Dad's ranch, his wonderful house? We all should go there. It was wonderful retreats. The people who had never been there, the young generation was like, well, crap, I didn't get enough money. I want you to sell this darn thing. They didn't realize there was relational conflict, and they kept going through this loop all the time. That's when they brought in people like Amy or Ivan Landsberg or people to help them deal with that conflict resolution. Process for resolving conflict. How many people have a conflict resolution committee in your charter? Raise your hand. You'd be top of the class. Nope. Right? Very hard to deal with. People don't want to deal with it. But if you should have 5 to 7 people, especially if you're a large family. Conflict resolution committee. Family members have direct access to the committee and they know about it. Right? If I have a grievance, I don't go talk to my cousin and my third cousin and the other guy and the attorney. I go to the conflict resolution committee. Then the conflict resolution committee goes and collects the data. Right? They're independent. They go say, hey, let's go collect and see whether this conflict is a valid conflict. Then they decide whether something needs to be done to resolve the conflict. This is really important. So they're going to decide this cooling off period. What do we all try to do on conflicts? There's really, the family I was with in California that I mentioned about selling the company, back in April, that was red hot, right? And they called us in, we have to do this. We're now 6 months away from April. When we were there this week, they said, I don't remember what that was. I don't remember what I was so upset about. I don't remember, time does that. So this cooling off period can help so that you can come in and have a rational conversation around it. So make sure you build that into what you're talking about. If not, agree to mediation, and then professional facilitators. This is the one you want to avoid. By the time you get through all those other steps, what was it, 7? You're avoiding this because everybody can do this. I can go get courts and lawyers and all of that. What you're trying to say is, before we're going to go adjudicate this, you're going to agree through the family charter that this is our conflict resolution process. You haven't given up your rights to go do this, but we're going to go through all of this before we do that. Okay, I've got case studies in here that we could walk through of different things, and it's 5:15. Walk through the case studies? Okay. So they're on this continuum. I've given you a lot of case studies as we went through. So I'm going to go, there's a lot of these guys in the room. Identify yourself. No, I'm just kidding. Controlling owners. So this is an entrepreneurial marine industry, global leader in their niche. He was 67 years old, 2 kids working in the business in their mid-30s, no board of directors, no succession, very little financial systems, and a reactive culture. I'm always amazed how good family businesses are at being successful when all the consultants come in and tell you that you were highly reactive and you weren't planning, but somehow you're very good at what you do. Highly volatile, didn't have the right experience at the board level. Second generation was uncertain about their roles in the company, and the second generation was frustrated with the chaotic environment. So in this one, it was difficult. We had to come in and restructure the executive team and bring in the right professional management to run the company. That was number 1. Number 2, we introduced a performance management system to monitor performance. So what was happening was you had a poor CFO, you had dad running the company, there was no performance management for how we were going to manage KPIs and other things. There's a lot of families that when the patriarch's there, everybody says we don't need those. Dad knows, he's brilliant. I've heard visionary describing controlling owners all the time. He always knows what to do. But how do you have discipline around for what dad's going to do? Then we did an estate plan, a succession plan, governance structures, and then set clear expectations for what the return on the capital was going to be for all the family members. Outcomes, generational transition, this one, once they had all those things fixed, much more profitable. Allows the family transparency. Remember we said trust into the business? So that monitoring system, now the family has the transparency they need. There's not turmoil around that anymore. And now they're preparing to bring a board of directors in. I'll let you read that. And again, these will be in the materials. So high level, what you'll read in all of these, as I go through these, I think about it, I probably told you. You'll read that there was a lack of real alignment, right? So you had all these different people and folks. And then you have 2 siblings inside the business, 2 siblings outside. You've got a husband in as the CEO. All of these case studies are going to tell you there was a lack of transparency, trust, and reporting to the family. And when we came in, it was putting in and building systems to put in transparency, trust through a systematic way. So let me flip to this last one because it's the one I like the best. Okay. So this is a well-known manufacturing company that's a brand name that you would know. 4 generations. So we had 2 in their 80s all the way down to the 2 to 10-year-olds. And Mr. G1 here was still active in the business. Still came to work, still was there all the time. 4 individual operating enterprises, voting control of the company was still with dad. Family meetings were not held, that was family vacations. And the company's CFO was tasked with family office duties. So the company was really struggling to grow. They were deathly afraid that if something happened, this voting control, all of a sudden, under their estate plan, got split between all of those heirs. What a disaster, right? If all of a sudden I have 6, 23, all those people that now have a vote in the company. So they've done lots of estate planning, CEO succession, family, non-family. So what they do? Governance system, figured out what the family mission and vision was. We formalized a family office, took all of that responsibility out of the company and put professionals in to manage that. And then we had trustee education and succession. Why was that important? He was 80, he had done a lot of estate planning, he had over 90 trusts, and he had trustees everywhere that didn't know what their responsibilities were. So he picked his friend. He said, hey, Carlos, will you be a trustee on my trust? Oh, yeah. Hey, Ricardo, will you be a trustee? And his buddies all said, yeah. But then if he died, nobody had any idea what the responsibilities would be. We got a blended board, qualified outsiders and insiders. We went on a CEO succession. So he was 80. We didn't have much time, but that's why we put the board in first. If something happened to him, we felt that the board could help replace the successor CEO. And then this was a big one. We had to create a dividend policy. All of those family members that were out there, a lot of the tension that was being created was the company was growing, but they weren't getting any assets and they didn't know why. So again, we came up with criteria, we came up with an ROI, and we put a dividend policy in place so that those people knew exactly what they were entitled to. Came up with a family employment policy and said, here's how you get employed, here's what you have to have, here's what the qualifications are. And then what we did was interesting, which I don't know if it would work in Latin America. We created a voting trust. The issue was the family didn't want to have to deal with the succession of control of this company again from a legal and tax perspective. So what we set up was a trust that was going to control those shares in perpetuity. So the trust is now the voting owner of the business. And they decided that the trustees, the people who would get to vote that, were going to be a family member, a C-suite member who was in the company, and then the CEO of the company. And so now they don't have to worry about where those voting shares are going to go. What they do is through the family council, they elect the trustees who are going to vote these shares. What it does is it keeps those people from moving their shares. So go back to Pritzker. If this had been done in Pritzker, this would have controlled the company versus all that vote being moved around. Okay. So one, I want to thank you for your attention between lunch and cocktails. I know it's getting dark outside. I know you had a big day. We'll be around for cocktails and dinner. Again, what I want to leave you with is wealth transition is a process, and a lot of you have done a great job at it already. I've heard the stories. It's iterative and it keeps changing. What's going on with the millennials will change what you've done before. So you may have the greatest structure, but going back through these and thinking through them and thinking, have we really engaged those generations in the decision-making process is going to be key. And then the third thing I love is plagiarize, plagiarize, plagiarize. So all the great stories you hear from here, I take Justin Craig's book and Amy Schumann's stuff, and I talk about it all the time. There's a lot of great ideas out there, but taking those ideas and then go find the company that actually did it, because 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you how they screwed it up before they got it right. Right? It'll look cool. They're in the case study, and what you don't know is all the minutia that happened to get them there. So again, thank you for your attention. Really appreciate it. Thank you for having me again, Carlos. I appreciate that. And have a great rest of your week.